The blueprints weren't for a renovation, they were for an erasure. I found them tucked beneath a false bottom in my late husband's oak desk, a place he kept old love letters and his father's pocket watch. My son, David, had been in here earlier. Organizing, he'd called it. His scent still lingered, expensive cologne and ambition. My fingers, papery with age, trembled as I unrolled the crisp sheets. There, in stark black and white, was the ghost of my home, the Cypress House, with its century-old gables and sprawling verandas, was gone. In its place rose a sterile glass and steel structure labeled Sterling Shores Luxury Residences. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, settled in my chest. This wasn't a plan, it was a death warrant. 2 weeks later, my granddaughter Chloe sat across from me in the sunroom, the scent of salt and jasmine drifting through the open windows. She traced the rim of her teacup, her brow furrowed with a familiar worry. "Grandma," she began, her voice soft. "Dad's been saying, maybe it's time to consider taking a step back." I watched a gull soar over the churning gray waves of the Pacific. A step back from what, darling? I had been awake since sunrise, kneading dough for the morning's scones, negotiating with the linen supplier, and pruning the climbing roses that Richard, my Richard, had planted for me on our 10th anniversary. Chloe's gaze fell to her lap. She had her grandfather's honest eyes, incapable of deceit. "He says the upkeep is becoming a burden. That since Grandpa died. You've been shouldering everything alone." 3 years. Richard had been gone 3 years, taken by a sudden storm in his heart while mending the seawall. I'd found him there, his tools laid neatly beside him, looking out at the ocean he loved. "Your father used to work here," I reminded her gently, my voice tight. "He'd spend summers hauling luggage for guests, telling them stories about the cypress trees. He learned the tides on this shore." "He remembers," Chloe whispered, a flicker of pain in her eyes. "But he says it's different now, that it's too much for one person." She hesitated, pressing her lips together in that way she did when holding back a truth she knew would hurt. It was her mother's habit, a woman whose own ambitions couldn't keep pace with David's. "What else does he say?" "Chloe," I asked, my grip tightening on the warm ceramic of my mug. The color bloomed in her cheeks. "He says he's worried you're not going to be here much longer." The words hung in the air, a quiet, brutal verdict. Outside, the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel drive announced a delivery from town. The rhythm of the house, its steady, beating heart, continued on, oblivious. A heart David was planning to stop. That night, their voices drifted up from the flagstone patio below my bedroom window. Weaving through the sound of the crashing surf, David's tone was smooth, confident, the one he used to close a deal. "She'll be settled in a new place within a month. The papers will be signed before summer." I moved away from the window, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor, my body melting into the shadows. "And the historical commission," a woman's voice, sharp and clipped. "They've been making noises about preserving these old coastal properties." David laughed, a sound stripped of all warmth. "The commission is a toothless dog. Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes. Besides, once the house is gone, there's nothing left to preserve." My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a gasp. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. I crept back to the window. In the moonlight, I could see their silhouettes, David, gesturing with his phone, and a woman with sleek blonde hair leaning against the stone railing. The Harrisons, I presumed. The developers Chloe had mentioned were buying up coastline. "What about your daughter?" the woman asked. "Chloe." "She works for some little conservation nonprofit," David said, his voice dripping with dismissal. "What's she going to do about it?" They spoke of contracts and demolition timelines, their business jargon turning my home, my life's work, into a column of figures on a spreadsheet. When their footsteps finally faded, I stood frozen in the dark, one hand gripping the windowsill so tightly my knuckles ached. The old house groaned around me, the cypress trees whispering in the wind. For 40 years, Richard and I had poured our souls into this place. It was in the worn brass doorknobs, the salt-faded paint, the pencil marks inside the pantry charting David's growth. I had never felt like a stranger here. Until now, sleep was impossible. I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in my hands, and watched the moon trace a silver path across the dark, heaving ocean. You don't fight a predator by showing your fear. By the time the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gray, I knew exactly what I had to do. I called Arthur Finch at 8:00 a.m. sharp. His firm's office was in one of the old brick buildings downtown, smelling perpetually of worn leather and brewing tea. Arthur had handled the Vance family's legal affairs since my father-in-law's time, and his voice, when he came on the line, was a comforting balm of concerned professionalism. "Eleanor," he said, bypassing his secretary's screening. "Susan said you sounded urgent. Is everything all right?" I looked out the kitchen window, where David's sleek silver car was just pulling up the drive, a vulture circling its prey. "Someone is trying to tear down my house, Arthur," I said, my voice low and steady, "and I need to make sure they fail." An hour later, I sat opposite him at his vast mahogany desk as he laid out the deeds and property records, like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "Everything is in your name, free and clear," he confirmed, peering at me over his spectacles. "No liens, no complications." I pushed the rolled-up blueprints across the desk. His eyes widened as he studied them, his expression shifting from professional concern to personal indignation. "That boy always was too ambitious for his own good," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I told him everything: the late-night conversation, David's dismissive attitude toward Chloe, the mention of a summer deadline. He listened, his fingers steepled, his gaze never leaving my face. "And you want to make the property untouchable," he concluded when I finished. "I want to ensure the Cypress House remains the Cypress House long after I'm gone." I corrected him. He was quiet for a long moment, tapping a pen against a legal pad. "Historic designation is one route, but it can be slow and bureaucratic. David and his partners could tie it up in legal challenges for months, perhaps years." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with the thrill of a complex problem. "But there is a faster, more ironclad solution, too, in fact, that we can use in tandem." He explained it to me in his calm, methodical way. "First, we would create an irrevocable living trust, immediately transferring ownership of the guest house out of my hands and into the trust's. I would remain the lifetime trustee, with all rights to live and work here, but I would no longer be the legal owner. You cannot sell what you do not own, Eleanor," he stressed. "Any purchase agreement you might be pressured into signing would be instantly void. The successor trustee, who would take over after me, Chloe, of course," I said without hesitation. "Second," Arthur continued, "we will file a perpetual heritage easement with the state and federal registry. It's a conservation tool. It legally restricts any future owner from altering the historical character of the property, or, most importantly, demolishing it. A violation would incur federal penalties. It's a fortress." He pulled a fresh pad toward him. "But Eleanor, you must be certain. An irrevocable trust is exactly that. It cannot be undone." A wave of profound relief washed over me. "Good," I said, my voice clear and firm. "Draw up the papers." David arrived that afternoon, bearing a pot of orchids and a practiced, worried smile. "Mom," he said, kissing my cheek with the cold indifference of a stranger, "you look tired." He followed me into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the room, already mentally stripping it of my presence. "I've been thinking," he began, leaning against the butcher block where I'd taught him to bake bread as a boy. "This place, it's a lot for you. I was talking with a friend of mine, Dr. Jennings, a top neurologist. He thinks it would be a good idea for you to have a chat with him, just to establish a baseline for the future." The words were so smooth, so reasonable, delivered with the perfect amount of loving concern. It was like watching a spider spin a web. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. A neurologist. David, my mind is as sharp as it ever was. "Of course it is," he soothed, placing a hand on my arm. "This is just about being prepared. Proactive. Think of it as an insurance policy." Insurance? Legal questions. It was all there. The groundwork for declaring me incompetent. "I'll think about it," I said, the phrase already becoming my shield. The next morning, I drove not to Dr. Jennings, but to Dr. Albright, our family physician for 30 years. George Albright had treated David for scraped knees and Chloe for the chicken pox. He listened patiently as I explained, without naming names, that I needed an official, documented assessment of my cognitive function. "Let's just say I'm updating my estate plan and want to leave no room for questions," I told him. He conducted the tests with a gentle professionalism: memory recall, pattern recognition, complex reasoning. "Eleanor," he said an hour later, signing the bottom of a multi-page evaluation with a flourish, "you're sharper than half my patients under 50. He stamped the document with his official seal and handed me a notarized copy. "If anyone suggests you're not of sound mind," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a look of complete understanding, "they clearly don't know you at all." I tucked the affidavit into my purse. It felt as solid and reassuring as a block of granite. Chloe came by that evening, a small, gift-wrapped box in her hand. "I know this is weird," she said, her cheeks slightly flushed. "But I was thinking about all the stories you tell about this place. I thought maybe you could record them." She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, was a tiny digital voice recorder. "You can just talk into it whenever you remember something, for a family history project." Our eyes met, and in that instant, I knew this wasn't just for a history project. It was a weapon, a way to capture the truth in a voice no one could deny. I took the small device in my hand, its cool metal surface a stark contrast to the warmth of her gesture. "Thank you, darling," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "That's a wonderful idea." A black sedan, so polished it reflected the brooding cypress trees like a dark mirror, crunched up the gravel drive a week later. David emerged first, straightening the knot of his silk tie. He opened the passenger door for a couple who looked as if they'd been sculpted from ice and ambition. Mr. Harrison was tall and silver-haired, with a handshake that was less a greeting than a statement of ownership. His wife, Sarah, was impeccably dressed in a cream-colored suit, her smile perfectly calibrated and utterly devoid of warmth. "Mom," David said, ushering them onto the veranda. "I'd like you to meet James and Sarah Harrison from the Sterling Corporation." "Mrs. Vance?" Sarah Harrison said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "What a charming property. You must have so many wonderful memories here." The words were a casual eulogy, delivered before the body was even cold. I smiled, a slow, deliberate movement of my lips, and gestured them inside, my hand trembling just enough to be noticed. "Please, come in. The kettle is on." They bypassed the living room with its comfortable, worn armchairs and fireplace, heading straight for the dining room. James Harrison placed a sleek tablet on my antique mahogany table, its modern gloss a jarring intrusion on the aged wood. "We thought, instead of dusty old blueprints," he said with a patronizing wink, "we'd show you the future." He tapped the screen. A video began to play, a symphony of corporate propaganda set to optimistic, soulless music. I watched as a digital drone swooped over a photorealistic rendering of the Cypress house. Then, with a sickeningly smooth animation, my home dissolved into a cloud of digital dust from the empty space. The glass towers of Sterling Shores rose, glinting in a synthetic sunset. A marina replaced the old seawall Richard had built, a concrete parking lot paved over my rose garden. Demolition is slated to begin the Monday after the closing, James said cheerfully. We have the crews on standby, a very efficient timeline. My blood ran cold. I could feel the small, hard rectangle of the recorder in my apron pocket, a silent witness. I pressed the discreet button to begin recording. Oh, my, I said, my voice a breathy, fragile whisper. I let my eyes well up, playing the part of the overwhelmed widow. It's all so much. Richard always handled the business side of things. My old head just can't quite grasp these modern marvels. It was the precise bait I had hoped they'd take. David placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Don't you worry about a thing, Mom. That's why I'm here. I'll handle all the complicated details for you. Sarah Harrison leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, condescending purr. Exactly. Eleanor, this is a practical decision. You've earned the right to rest, not to worry about leaky roofs and property taxes. The best thing is not to cloud a sound investment with sentiment. Our architectural survey confirmed the existing structure has no real historic value, James added, waving a dismissive hand at the hand-carved mantelpiece. It's functionally obsolete. Far better to make way for a property that serves the needs of the modern luxury market. His words, David's words, Sarah's words they spooled silently onto the tiny device in my pocket, the proof of their callousness, their greed, their utter dismissal of me, was now a permanent record. I looked up from the glowing screen, forcing a wavering smile. You know, I said, my voice gaining a touch of wistful strength. Next week marks 50 years since Richard and I bought this house, our golden anniversary, in a way. I paused, letting the feigned emotion settle in the room. I'm having a small dinner party to celebrate, just a few old friends and neighbors. I turned my gaze to include all three of them. It would mean so much to me if you would all join, to celebrate the house one last time, a final, beautiful memory before everything changes. David, Sarah, and James exchanged a swift, triumphant glance. They saw a sentimental old woman, a final hurdle easily cleared with a bit of social grace. They saw the finish line. Mrs. Vance, that's a lovely thought, James said, his voice oozing insincere charm. We'd be honored. Mom, that's a wonderful idea, David beamed, relief washing over his features. A real celebration to mark the transition. After they left, the silence of the house settled around me. I stood at the dining room table, staring at the screen of the tablet they'd forgotten in their haste. I touched it, and the image of Sterling Shores vanished, leaving a black, reflective surface. In it, I saw the face of a woman they had profoundly underestimated. I pulled the recorder from my pocket and pressed stop. My armor was complete. I walked to the telephone in the hall, my steps no longer frail but firm and measured on the old heart pine floors. I dialed Chloe's number. When she answered, my voice was calm and clear. The party is on, I said. Next Friday at 7. Tell Arthur and Dr. Albright I expect them to be my guests of honor. By 7 o'clock, the dining room glowed. It was bathed in the warm, flickering light of 100 candles, their flames dancing in the polished silver and reflecting in the laughing eyes of old friends. The air smelled of roasted rosemary, sea salt, and beeswax. Dr. Albright was discussing sailing with a neighbor by the fireplace. Arthur Finch was deep in conversation with Chloe, a proud, paternal smile on his face. This room had seen 50 years of birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet winter evenings. It was a living archive of a family's love, and tonight, it was my fortress. At 7:15, they arrived. David, James, and Sarah walked in, their sharp city clothes a stark contrast to the comfortable warmth of the gathering. They brought a bottle of champagne so expensive it was ostentatious and a small, velvet-wrapped jewelry box. "Happy anniversary, Mom," David said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "To new beginnings." Sarah handed me the box, a little something to commemorate the occasion. I placed both gifts on a side table without a glance. There would be no new beginnings for them here. Dinner was a masterpiece. The conversation hummed, a symphony of shared memories and gentle laughter. David and the Harrisons sat at my table, supremely confident, believing themselves the guests of honor at a surrender. They smiled and nodded, playing their parts, oblivious to the fact that every other guest in the room was a member of my silent, loyal army. Finally, as dessert was served, David stood, tapping his glass for attention. The room quieted. "I'd like to propose a toast," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "To my mother, Eleanor Vance, for 50 years. She has poured her heart into this wonderful house. But time, as it does for all things, marches on, and it takes a special kind of wisdom and courage to know when it's time to turn the page and start a new chapter." He raised his glass to me, his eyes shining with false sincerity. "To Mom, for her grace in letting go and embracing the future." A polite, hesitant applause rippled through the room. I let it die down. Then slowly, I rose to my feet, my napkin slid from my lap to the floor. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that made him flinch. "You are absolutely right. This is the last time we will celebrate together in this way, but not for the reason you think." A nervous energy filled the air. Across the table, the Harrisons leaned forward, their polite smiles frozen in place. "Before we have cake," I announced, "I've put together a small presentation, a look back at the history of the Cypress House." I nodded to Chloe, who dimmed the lights and turned on the projector. The first image filled the wall behind me. It was not a faded family photograph, but a crisp, clear copy of a legal document. "This," I said, my voice resonating with newfound power, "is a notarized affidavit from Dr. George Albright, completed last week." I gestured to my old friend. Dr. Albright, who is with us tonight, conducted a full cognitive assessment. As you can see, the results were perfect. I am, in his professional medical opinion, fully and completely competent to manage my own affairs. Dr. Albright raised his coffee cup in a small, firm salute. A few guests chuckled. David's face went slack with shock. "But a sound mind, I've learned, is not always enough protection," I continued. "Sometimes, you need to record the truth." I clicked the remote. The image vanished, and a sound file appeared on the screen. Then, I played the recording. David's voice, slick and condescending, filled the silent room. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mom. I'll handle all the complicated details for you." Then Sarah Harrison's purr. Best not to cloud a sound investment with sentiment. And finally, James Harrison's dismissive tone. "The existing structure has no real historic value, functionally obsolete." A collective gasp swept through the room. Sarah's wineglass froze at her lips. James's fork clattered onto his plate. David's face had drained of all color. He looked like a ghost. "Quiet, dear," I said softly as he started to rise. "I'm not finished." I clicked the remote again. A new document appeared, this one bearing a federal seal. "This is the newly filed perpetual heritage easement for the Cypress House. My lawyer, Arthur Finch, who is also with us, can attest to its power. Arthur stood slowly. That document makes this property a federally protected landmark, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of the law. Any attempt to substantially alter or demolish this structure is now a federal crime. The room erupted in murmurs. James Harrison half rose from his chair. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered. I gave him my full attention. "I'm saying your demolition crews can go home. Mr. Harrison, there's nothing for them here." I clicked the remote one last time. And finally, this is the deed to the Cypress House, transferred last week into the Catherine Wells Irrevocable Heritage Trust. I looked directly at my son. My granddaughter Chloe is the successor trustee, which means the simple truth is this: I cannot sell you this property because I do not own it. Your purchase agreement is a worthless piece of paper. The silence stretched for a heartbeat, and then Mrs. Henderson, a neighbor from down the road, began to clap. Dr. Albright joined in, then Arthur. And soon the entire room was on its feet, the applause thundering, a wave of support that washed over me. The only three people not clapping sat frozen in their chairs, their faces masks of fury and humiliation. "This is fraud," James bellowed, finally finding his voice. "We'll sue." "You'll lose," Arthur said cheerfully from his table. "But I'd be happy to recommend counsel." Sarah grabbed her husband's arm. "James, we're leaving." They shoved their chairs back, the scraping sound an ugly scar on the beautiful evening. David started to follow them, then stopped. He turned back to me, his eyes wild with desperation. "Mom, please," he stammered. "We can work this out. There has to be a way." "There is," I said, my voice quiet again. All the fire banked to a cold, hard ember. "You can apologize to your daughter for believing her life's work was meaningless. You can apologize to this house for seeing it as nothing but an obstacle. And you can apologize to me for trying to steal my life from under my feet while pretending to be my son." He stared, speechless, his smooth facade completely shattered. "You'll regret this," he finally whispered. "The only thing I regret," I said, the words falling like stones into a deep well, "is that I raised a man who thinks a home is something you can liquidate." And with that, he turned and followed his partners into the darkness, a ghost leaving his own haunting grounds. After they were gone, the party truly began. It was a celebration of victory, of resilience. Later, when only Chloe and I remained, she hugged me tight. "I can't believe you did it, Grandma." I looked around the glowing room, at the portraits of ancestors on the walls, at the windows framing the moonlit ocean. "Honey," I said, taking her hand, "on your own ground, fighting for what you love, you can never be beaten." What do you think? Did David get what he deserved? Or was I too hard on my only son? Sometimes, protecting a legacy means making choices that break your own heart. If you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, let me know in the comments. Your stories give strength to us all. Thank you for listening. And please, subscribe for more stories of life, love, and the battles we fight to protect them.